Hi guys, welcome to this beginner's guide to how to start watercolor painting, and I've got 3 easy painting projects for you. But before I start those, I'm going to go through some really simple basic watercolor techniques that you can put in practice to paint these 3 projects. Let's get started. For a full list of the materials I'm using and a tutorial that I made all about the materials I use, please see the description below. I mostly use tubes, but I do like to squeeze them into pans. So this is what I do here. I get my tube of watercolor paint and I squeeze the paint into the pan and then put them in the watercolor box, or I do the same thing with a palette. I like to have sort of freshly squeezed paint. Now, if your paint has dried, you can spritz it a half an hour before you use them. It does moisten them, and that works with pans, ready-made pans, but also dried tube paint. So to start off with watercolour, just get a pinch of paint on the tip of your brush, put it in your palette and then add water. The more water you add, the lighter the colour. The more paint you add, the darker the colour. So here I've added lots of water and I'm painting wet on dry. You can see there the lovely sort of pale blue colour there. So really load your brush and just paint and enjoy it and experiment. That's how you learn, by practice. So here I've got more paint, less water, and you can see immediately it's a darker colour. It's important not to have the paint too thick because you want the light and white of the paper reflecting through the paint, because watercolour is a transparent medium. So that's wet on dry. This is wet on wet. So I'm wetting the paper with clean water and I'm going to apply the paint wet into wet. Now this is very wet paint, and if it's very wet, as you can see there, you can lose control. So I'm going to show you how to not lose control, and that is wet the paper first, but make sure that you wet it, let the water soak into the paper. Don't paint into a puddle because you'll lose control. So here I'm allowing it to soak into the paper, so there's no puddles. And now I'm going to apply my wet paint, taking off the excess there. As you can see there, I've painted wet into wet, one of the basic techniques of watercolour. You get soft edges, and I'm painting a slightly darker, creamier wash here. And this is pretty much damp into wet, so it doesn't move as much as wet paint because you've taken the excess paint off, but also it's slightly thicker and creamier, as you can see on those 3 dark marks. It's not running as much, but you've got some soft edges. And I'm going to show you the importance of this and how to use this in our 3 painting projects later in this tutorial. So here I'm painting damp into damp. So the top part of this square is damp, and so is the paint. So it doesn't run as much, but you've got a little bit more definition with a soft edge. But it's important to wipe that excess paint off on a paper towel, especially when you're a beginner, to control the paint. So I've got soft edges and it's not running too much. This is what happens when you load very wet paint into damp paint, dry paint that's drying. I'll give you a close-up here. One is you lose control, but also you get cauliflowers or back runs, as I'm pointing to here. And then you kind of can panic. So as long as you take that excess off, don't paint into puddles, and, you know, sort of really practice these techniques, you'll feel more confident. And you can try out these little painting projects after you have a practice using the techniques, and you can sort of start understanding watercolour. So I've mixed up some ultramarine and yellow here. So it's a mid-green. This is the type of lesson I teach beginners when they first join my classes. So I've drawn a very simple daisy outline and I'm painting wet on dry, and it's to show students how to paint around objects, but also how to use the paint correctly. So load that brush. Every time you paint an area, maybe just paint 2 strokes, load that brush again. So the trick is to make plenty of paint. What you don't want to do is have to mix up paint, you know, in the middle of this. You want plenty of paint. Make more than you think you need, and sort of practice this. Practice the control of painting round a shape using very wet paint. But the magic of this is you get this lovely luminosity and smoothness in the paint, even though you're using this really wet paint. I'm going to show you now what not to do. So a lot of students, when I start teaching them, just dip their paint into the wash and then just use it until the brush runs out of paint. But what happens is unevenness, and actually then when you go back in with a wet brush into that damp paint, you may get a cauliflower. Here's a close-up. Look at the very wet paint. Here, lovely sort of smoothness, and then look at the marks there that I've made because the paint has run out. So don't be afraid to load your brush every couple of strokes, and I'm just collecting the puddles here with a damp brush. You don't want those puddles to run back later, so you want to deal with those. What I'm going to show you now is how to paint wet in wet, painting around an object as well. So I've wet around this circle. I've mixed up some yellow and green, a bit of quinacridone gold with ultramarine. I'm wetting around the circle here with a size 10 brush. Now the trick is, if you don't wet the circle, the paint won't run onto there. So anything dry is protected in a way. So I'm carefully painting around that circle, making sure there are no puddles. And now I'm painting wet into wet, loading my brush still and painting up to the edge of the circle, and you get some smooth edges. And sometimes this is easier for beginners because you don't have things drying too quickly. But that daisy to the left, as long as you really load your brush, it gives you more time. One of the things we run out of is time in watercolor painting. As you can see, I'm tilting here as well to get the paint to sort of blend evenly, and as you can see there, I'm collecting a puddle that's called a bead at the bottom there. I'm going to talk more about a watercolor bead later. So I'm mixing up some quinacridone gold and a little bit of Prussian blue, about 50-50, taking the excess paint off. And I'm painting damp because the paint's slightly creamier, taking the excess off, there's not as much moisture, into wet. And as you can see there, I've got a lovely sort of soft edge. And here I'm painting wet into wet. So the paint is wet as the surface of the paper there. So as you can see, it spreads more than the damp paint. And all these are essential techniques in watercolor painting and important to practice if you're a beginner. So what I'm doing now is I'm actually putting wet paint into a damp area. And again, reminding you, this is not what you want to do. Well, not at this stage of painting. You want control. You want to know what's going on. Otherwise, you're going to get a back run and you're just going to get puddles and lose control. So it's all about the control at the beginning. And I always say to my students, once you learn all the rules, you can break all the rules and you can have fun. I love having cauliflowers, but I want to know the reason why and how to avoid them. The other thing you don't want to do is what I'm doing here is don't fiddle. Don't go back over damp paint. Just let it dry and work on top later. Don't try to fix things, especially paint that's drying. You can see what's happened there. I've got a cauliflowered edge there. Sometimes if you've got an underpainting as well, you could make things muddy. So just try to avoid overworking. Just learn all the rules to begin with. Practice on backs of pieces of paper, even cartridge paper to begin with, just so you build your confidence. Learn those techniques. So let's put these techniques into practice with these 3 painting projects. So I've divided my painting up into 3 smaller paintings. I'm going to work from the left with a really simple landscape. So I've mixed up a puddle of ultramarine. I'm going to paint a large sky. So make sure you have plenty of paint, as I said at the beginning of this tutorial. As you saw there, I loaded that brush. It's a size 10 round brush. We work with soft head brushes in watercolor so that it glides across the paper and doesn't disturb the paint underneath because it isn't permanent. And here's that watercolor bead. Now I've used some framing tape just underneath my pad there so that it tilts the painting so I can see that bead and I know I've got enough paint. Take your time. Load that brush and let the bead fall down and just keep painting, loading your brush. And what you get, as you can see at the top, there is a lovely flat even wash. You don't want to go back and fiddle with that. Just take your time. As you can see, there's a lovely bead there. So load your brush, glide it across that bead about 50-50 and just keep painting each row, collecting paint as you go. I'm actually adding water to my wash. I want to dilute it because as the sky goes further to the horizon, it gets paler, and this will create depth in your landscape painting. So this is a lot paler. So I'm still collecting that bead and working my way down, still using the same process, but with a lighter watercolour. You won't see it immediately, but you'll start to see it paling. And just take your time. Don't feel rushed. I'm adding more water. I want to make it even paler. And you almost sometimes have to exaggerate it. Again, it's practice and getting the feel of it. And the only way you can do that is the experience of having a go, practicing. I just drew a horizon line in there. So that's the only drawing you have to do here. One line towards the end of the paper. So I'm just using water now, and just using water and allowing the bead to develop and then gliding across with just clean water from my little pot. Well, it's not quite clean. And one of the tips I can give you as well, always keep changing your water if you're mixing colours. Here I'm just using the ultramarine blue, so not a problem. So as you can see there, how much paler it's got now towards the horizon. So as you can see there, there is a bead still. And I've just cleaned my brush here, taken the excess water off, and it's going to act like a sponge and it's going to soak up that bead, because you don't want that wet paint to run into your drying paint later. As you saw, it could create a cauliflower. So that's a really good way of removing the watercolour bead. So this is a really cool technique. I'm just scrunching up some paper towel and pressing down onto the damp paint to lift off the paint. And you can see there, it creates the look of a cloud. And the clouds at the top of the sky will be bigger, and as they go towards the horizon, they'll be smaller. As you saw there, I took away my framing tape because I couldn't press down hard enough there. So I'm just sculpting these clouds. What I would suggest is just use different parts of the paper towel. Don't use a part where it's got blue paint on, because you're just pressing more blue paint back into your picture. So for the smaller clouds, I've just scrunched up my paper towel to a smaller size to create those little clouds as they go off towards the horizon. And this again will create depth in your painting, because smaller things look much further away. You're creating an illusion. So I'm mixing up some more ultramarine blue here with my size 10 brush, adding a pinch of yellow. So it's a blue-green. Cooler colours recede and look further away in painting, and warmer colours come forward, and darker colours as well. So this is more of a mid-green, so it'll be in my sort of middle ground. And I'm going to make a lighter, sort of brighter, sunnier green for the foreground. One of the most important things in watercolour is to allow your painting to dry between stages. So the painting is dry now, and I'm painting that blue-green colour in the distance, wet on dry, using my size 10 round brush. So really remember to load that brush. If you want to, you can put it on a tilt like I'm doing now to make sure I've got plenty of paint. Now I'm loading the green paint, and I'm painting it a little bit like I did the sky, wet into wet, sort of gliding it over that blue-green, coming down to the foreground with that lovely sort of yellow-green paint right down to the bottom. So I'm going to mix up some damp paint so it's slightly creamier, and it's with the ultramarine with some yellow, and I'm taking the excess off on my paper towel, painting damp into wet there with that green paint, leaving the background. Mixing up some more paint here, slightly creamier, touch more ultramarine, slightly stronger, darker colour, and I'm painting damp into damp now. So the surface is damp and so is the paint, so it doesn't run as much. So they're more sort of definite marks, but they've got soft edges here. And you can paint some little grasses as well in the foreground. Remember, objects in the foreground get bigger. So I'm mixing up a very blue-green paint here, mostly blue with a touch of yellow, taking the excess paint off and just painting damp into damp, these very small marks in the distance there. Again, it's a good time to allow the painting to dry. And what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up some ultramarine with a touch of the yellow, blue-green, taking the excess off and just painting a little bit more detail in the distance with a cooler colour. So it just looks like a little mountain or a hill in the distance there. Mixing up some ultramarine, thicker ultramarine with a touch of yellow, and just painting some grasses now, wet on dry in the foreground. This will come forward, the hard edges are crisp and they will come forward to create detail, and those details will make the painting look more 3D because we see more information in the foreground, that things that are nearest to us. I'm also painting some little marks, little stippling marks, again to create darks and details, as you can see here close up. All painted wet on dry. So I think I'll leave that painting there for now and allow it to dry. For my second project, I'm going to paint a sunset and a palm tree. So this is a little bit more in depth, a touch more challenging, but I'm going to use the same techniques. And I'm going to use this reference photograph here, but I'm not going to copy. I'm just going to use some of the sky and just one palm tree to keep it simple. So again, preparing my colours to begin with. I've mixed up a puddle of ultramarine and now I'm making a puddle of orange paint. This is all for the sky. So I'm making a red orange, so it's mostly red with some yellow there and plenty of it. You don't want to run out. Now I'm mixing some yellow here to start with, and I'm going to add a little bit to that red, so I've got a little bit more of a yellow orange, and it's just to create a little bit of variety of colour in the sky. I'm also mixing up a little bit of pink. This is going to be a barrier between the blue paint and the sort of yellow orange paint, so I don't get any sort of muddy colours or greens. So if you're wetting a large area, you want a bigger brush. This is a soft haired brush. And I'm again putting my painting on a tilt. I've got some clean water and I'm wetting over the palm tree, all of the sky area except the sun. Remember that that wet paint won't run onto the dry area. I've got to carefully paint round the sun there with the tip of the brush. You may want to swap, as I've done here, to a smaller brush just to paint carefully with the water around the sun. So I really want to make sure that water soaks into the paper and there are no puddles. I'm starting off with the ultramarine, painting wet into wet with my size 10 brush. I've just tilted there to allow the paint to run down a little bit. Just using clean water now to blend that blue so it's really pale at the top there. So just a clean damp brush with clean water, just adding a pinch of that very pale pink, painting wet into wet and blending it over the blue to the top of the palm tree. I've rinsed my brush and I'm painting wet into wet the yellow orange with my size 10 brush. And again, sort of working my way down, loading that brush each time, plenty of paint. And now I'm loading my brush with the red orange and I'm painting sort of in the middle of the sky and working my way down to the sun, painting wet into wet, loading that brush each time. And now I'm loading the brush again with a little bit more red in the orange and just working my way down here, painting very carefully around the sun. It's dry, so your paint won't run on there. And I'm just working down to the horizon as well. Really, my brush is very loaded, so you've got that smoothness in the wash there. And just sort of finessing there and just filling in any of the gaps. And now mixing up a touch more red here, slightly creamier with my size 10 brush. Taking the excess off on my paper towel and just painting damp into wet, some stronger red colour, which kind of blends with that red orange as well. So you get a really sort of darker red orange, just blending it into the wet sky, damp into wet. Mixing up a little bit more red now, it's quite creamy straight from the tube, rinsing my brush here, adding a touch of yellow so it's a really creamy red-orange colour. I just want to paint some clouds here around the sun and make it sort of stronger colour around the sun, so make your eye really go to the sun there to make it look even whiter and lighter. So painting this damp into wet still and painting some clouds just above here, adding a touch of blue to the red orange there to make a sort of more shadowy colour. Painting this damp into damp now so it doesn't run as much. And you've got some cloud shadow colours there. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. What I'm doing now is I'm mixing up some ultramarine with some Winsor Red. Any red will do. So it's to make a really dark colour. I'm preparing the sea and the foreground colours. And I'm also mixing up some red orange. I am painting the sea to begin with wet on dry. It's kind of an underpainting. In watercolour we work in layers. We wait for those layers to dry and then we work on top, but they're transparent layers. It's important to remember the light comes from the paper. I don't use white paint unless it's for a kind of special technique towards the end. So the light and white comes from the paper. So you have to work in these transparent layers and allow them to dry, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm allowing my painting to dry once more. I'm mixing up some ultramarine with some red here, and I'm working wet on dry. And it's a kind of a paler colour because I want the sea to be sort of looking further away here. So I'm working, painting up to the horizon, wet on dry, and then coming down to the sort of sand or foreground area there, using my size 10 round brush. And as you can see, I've painted over the palm tree trunk as well, because that's going to be so much darker. So don't worry, because we're working light to dark. So that's going to be much darker than the sea. So I can work on top of that later. So I'm lifting off with my paper towel the reflection of the sun in the water just by swiping it gently. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. So I'm painting the foreground. It's going to be much darker than the sea, so it really comes forward. So I'm mixing up some creamy ultramarine and the Winsor Red with a touch of yellow as well. And I'm painting this wet on dry with my size 10 brush, starting at the sort of water's edge, working my way to the foreground, loading my brush each time, sort of continuing with those techniques. This time I'm lifting out the reflection of the sun with my damp, clean brush instead of the paper towel. You get slightly different effect. So rinse your brush, take off the excess moisture and then lift. It acts like a sponge, a bit like when you're removing the watercolour bead. And again, I'm going to allow my painting to dry. I'm mixing up some orange here, the red and the yellow, and I'm going to do some glazing. Glazing is a very thin wash that can push back paint and, you know, create distance, change the colour. And it's changed the colour here, but I wanted some more orange in that reflection of the sun. So it kind of creates that lovely transparent effect. Think of it as a sort of thin piece of coloured glass, and do this wet on dry. Again, I'm going to allow my painting to dry. It kind of fixes the watercolour, but remember, watercolour isn't permanent. We have these soft brushes that we gently paint over the top so it doesn't disturb the paint underneath. So I'm painting the palm tree. I'm using a mixture, as you saw there, of ultramarine with some Winsor Red. You can use Cadmium red and some of the yellow as well. So you get quite a dark, neutral colour. And I'm just carefully painting the tree trunk and the top part of the palm tree here, wet on dry with my size 10 brush. And as you can see, that dark trunk of the palm tree really does come forward over the sea, as I mentioned earlier. To create thin marks, I'm using a twig straight from the garden. I'm sharpening it with a pencil sharpener. It gives a lovely sharp point. I'm using my brush to apply the paint to the tip of the twig, and I'm just drawing with the twig now, really wet on dry, to create those thin branches on the palm tree. And it really does steady your hand as well, and it's a great way of painting or drawing thin marks in watercolour, and extremely cost effective. Using the same colour, I've swapped to my brush now, my size 10 brush, painting wet on dry the leaves on the palm tree here. Just keeping it really, really simple. take your time and remember to breathe. I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. I've mixed up again the ultramarine with the red there with a touch of yellow, and I'm painting wet on dry. The very sort of bottom of the painting there where the foreground is, and painting some darker grasses in. It just brings it forward and it creates depth in my painting. Again, it's a dark layer, but it is transparent. You should be able to see the layers underneath, the light reflected from the paper. I'm also using my twig to create the look of grasses by pulling up the paint. For my final project, I am painting a sky, mountains and water, keeping everything really simple. I'm drawing with an HB pencil, the water's edge, and then 3 separate mountains. And I'm mixing up now some ultramarine and burnt sienna. This is for the sky. So on the left there's about 80% ultramarine and 20% burnt sienna. On here on the right, it'll be 80% burnt sienna with about 20% ultramarine. So you get a warm grey colour, and on the left a blue grey colour. And I'm mixing up some raw sienna as well. So I'm wetting the sky with a large soft haired brush, but I'm actually leaving some dry areas as well, so you can sort of get some hard edges as well as soft edges. So it's quite nice to try out both those techniques, painting right down to the water's edge, using the raw sienna and painting it wet on wet around the horizon area, going up to kind of the middle of the sky, wet in wet there. And I'm actually going to paint that in the water, wet on dry, so it kind of reflects that colour as well, working my way down to the water's edge in the foreground. So I've loaded my brush with the blue-grey. I'm painting wet into wet, but as you can see there at the top of the clouds, there's some crisp hard edges where I didn't wet the paper. I'm tilting as well. So you get some really nice effects here. You can vary your soft and hard edges. I'm adding a little bit of that warm grey now as well, painting wet into wet, tilting my painting. So this is quite an atmospheric sky and a good one to practice. I'm painting around some clouds here, but I've got soft edges in the middle there, and it's wet into wet. So you can see the sort of different edges make such a difference. So those hard edges come forward, and remember the top of the sky is nearest to us, so it creates depth in the painting. So I've rinsed my brush here, taking the excess moisture off my brush, and I'm just blending that dark into the raw sienna there so it kind of disappears. And now I'm using the scrunched up paper towel and lifting off some clouds as well. So using those techniques that I used in the first project, and it creates some lovely light fluffy clouds there. Again, rinsing my brush, taking the excess moisture off the brush, and I'm going to lift off with the brush this time and soften and blend some of the hard edges underneath the cloud, and keeping the top light part of the cloud sharp hard edges there. So just blending and creating some shadows as well, especially on the top cloud there. A good tip is always to keep cleaning your brush and then taking the excess moisture off and then blending again so you don't contaminate your brush with some of the sky colour. And you can sort of sculpt your sky, just make sure your brush isn't too wet. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry. And what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up a very dilute ultramarine with about 20% burnt sienna. I'm painting this very thin light wash over all of the mountain area. So this is actually for the most distant mountain. But when you paint it all over the mountain area, you don't get any sort of hard edges. So if I'm going to paint the mountain, for instance, on the left later, I don't have to bump it up to a hard edge that I previously painted for the distant mountain. So you're kind of actually layering here. It's a really good way of painting mountains as well. So as you saw there, I painted it right down to the water's edge, and now I'm collecting that puddle with a clean, damp brush. So I'm using the same colour, which is a pale colour, and I'm using the belly of the brush to create a dry brush technique. So not all of the paint flows on there, not like I was loading my brush before. So you get this lovely sparkly effect, which you can see there on the water. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more and build another layer of the mountains, this time the mountain on the right hand side, and I'm painting wet on dry with a darker mixture of ultramarine and burnt sienna, using my size 10 round brush. Again, using that same colour, taking the excess paint off on my paper towel, using the belly of the brush, this time working sort of middle of the water, coming down to the foreground there to create some darker marks, using that dry brush techniques to create some more darks and sparkle in the water. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more, and I'm going to paint the larger mountain to the left here, the one that's sort of nearest to us, using ultramarine with a tiny touch of burnt sienna, so it's the darkest dark, painting this wet on dry again. And as you can see, these sort of layers, that particular layer wet on dry pulls away from that most distant mountain there, so I'm carefully loading my brush and painting it down to the water's edge over the sort of little hill there to the right hand side. Again, using that dark there and just sort of painting more in the foreground there to create some darks to pull that forward, and even using my brush to really fill in the very bottom area there. So you've got that lovely sort of graduation of dark, medium tones and lighter tones that sort of create depth in your painting. So I'm cleaning my brush, taking off the excess moisture, and I'm actually lifting off some paint here on the right hand little hill. I felt it was too dark. Now, watercolour isn't permanent, so you can lift off. I would say if you're going to do this, keep it to the minimum. You don't want to start lifting off everything because your painting can start looking a little bit flat or even muddy. But as you can see there, it's just lightening that hill a little bit so it looks like it's further back, so the left hand one comes forward a little bit more. So I've removed the washi tape to have a look at the paintings to see if I need to do any more. It's a good time to sort of be really objective, stand back so you don't overwork them. But there's a few little things that I need to adjust in the palm tree painting. I think I dropped some paint on there. So I'm going to show you how to lift off. I'm using a small synthetic brush, clean water, take the excess paint off again on the paper towel, and then just work at it. Ease that dark off there. So as you can see there, I keep cleaning my brush and then working at, it's like a stain, how you'd remove a stain. So just carefully do this and just work at it, and then sort of use your paper towel to lift off any moisture. I'm doing this on a little mark here I've got. So it's a good way of correcting sort of any mistakes you might have made as well, or if you actually get sort of drip a little bit of paint on your painting by accident. So I'm doing the same here and then using the paper towel to lift off. Another way of actually lifting off is I'm using a bristle brush here. It really does take the paint off really well. You can use synthetic or a bristle or even a sponge. What you don't want to do is use your sort of soft haired brushes because you could actually ruin the tips of them. So I'm actually lifting off the sun area here just to make sure the sort of, especially the outside edge is lovely and soft. And remember, watercolour isn't permanent, so it comes off. It doesn't entirely come off, there's a slight staining there, but it will lighten it. But remember, keep cleaning the brush, taking the excess moisture off on your paper towel, and then finally lift off as well with a paper towel on your painting. So I'm just sort of showing you here, you can lift off again here. I'm using the paper towel to lift off the reflection and the light coming down in the foreground. It can become quite sort of fun actually lifting off. All I will say is, sometimes you have to stop yourself. You don't realise you're doing too much. But sometimes if you do lift off, you may need to add more paint. So I'm adding a little bit more of that orange paint there. So here I'm making a little correction using the little bristle brush, clean damp brush, and just lifting off that dark mark. Now I always say to my students, if you're going to take something out, you kind of have to put stuff back. So here I'm working wet on dry, and I've dried the painting, and I'm just repainting some of these branches here to kind of tidy up and to disguise the little blotchy mark underneath. I'm also painting some grasses wet on dry here around the reflection area so it doesn't look too obvious that I lifted off. Another thing you can do to disguise areas but also to stop yourself from painting is to have a little spatter, and I always do this to finish off my watercolour painting. Just make sure you protect other parts of the painting with some paper towel. So I thought it'd be quite nice to lift off a little white sail here on my last painting. So I'm just using the little synthetic brush and lifting off with the paper towels. You can work at it and ease it off is what I'm doing here. Just remember to keep cleaning that brush. It's so effective. And so I'm just going to paint a little reflection underneath here using the tip of the brush with a very dilute ultramarine and burnt sienna mix. So here's a close-up of the paintings. I'm really pleased with them, and I really hope you found this tutorial helpful in getting started with watercolour, learning those basic techniques and putting them into practice. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. And if you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel where you'll get updates of my latest tutorials. And if you'd like to get access to my exclusive weekly tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching this video. Happy painting. Bye for now.